All right, so before I begin my lecture for today, let me tell you for the last time now what you should expect for next week. So, today we're going to try to take the narrative up to 1857, beginning in the 1750s. This lecture that I'm giving you encompasses actually what I do in my upper division class on history of British India in 5 weeks. So you're getting about 5 weeks in one single lecture, and there are enormous number of important trajectories. But again, don't worry about the details so much. Try to keep the broader picture in mind. All right. And in my lecture on Monday, we're going to essentially take the narrative up to the beginnings of Indian nationalism and the advent of Gandhi, the emergence of Gandhi, right, from 1857 till about the 1920s. And then on Wednesday, we're going to cover the period from the 1920s until the achievement of independence in 1947. And I'm going to conclude with some remarks about the history of India in the post-1947 period. All right. Friday, a week from today, there'll be a review session. All right. So this is what the trajectory is for the rest of this quarter. And you will receive the study sheet. The last section meeting is on Friday. So after that section meeting is over, the study sheet will be emailed to you, right? And what you will have in the study sheet are 9 questions, and you should prepare for all of these questions because the final exam will be drawn from these questions. Okay, that is the portion of the final exam which has to do with the essay questions, because recall that there is a small portion of the final exam which is going to be based on IDs. The study sheet will not have the list of IDs. That accounts for 20% of the grade, but it will have all the questions. And the questions that you get on the day of the exam, you'll get 5 questions and you'll answer 4 out of those 5 questions. But all of the 5 questions that you get will be questions that were on your study sheet. So there'll be no surprises there at all. All right. I also want to tell you that once the study sheet has been handed out to you, please do not email either me or any of the TAs regarding any of the questions or anything having to do even remotely with those questions, okay, that appear on the study sheet. I should be quite clear about that. And so, if you send an email to either me or one of the TAs and ask some question which has some remote relationship with that, you're not going to get an answer to that question. All right? Now, let me go back to the events of the 1750s. Right? So what I described to you at that point was the emergence of the company, the expansion of the company, the various kinds of encounters that the company has with Indian powers, principally the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb himself in the 1780s, right? And then the circumstances which led to the British becoming a player in the 1720s, 1730s. There's a decline on the West Coast trade. Bengal starts to assume more importance, right? Aurangzeb has died in 1707. And what you have is a reversion back to the kinds of themes that we have seen in Indian history before. That is, the center, in a way, collapses, but that's not anarchy. It's not the collapse of it's not chaos. What you have is regional powers establishing themselves. So the people who used to serve under the Mughal Emperor start to assume more importance, start to assume great powers unto themselves. Right? That's a situation that we have described. And in Bengal, you have a situation where a young man in his late 20s, by the name of Siraj-ud-daulah, he becomes a Nawab of Bengal. And in that year, he's going to ask the British to remove the fortifications, the military fortification that they have installed in Calcutta, right, without his permission. And this is what is going to lead to a contest of wills between him and the British. The British are going to be led by a young man called Robert Clive. Well, he's a bit older than Siraj-ud-daulah, right, but he's not all that old himself. He's an employee of the East India Company. He's a soldier. Recall that he had served in India in the 1740s, early 1750s. He goes back to England, tries to win a seat in the House of Commons, squanders the immense fortune that he had already built up, comes back to India to make another fortune. This is going to be much greater than the fortune he had established before, right? and he is going to give battle to Siraj-ud-daulah. Now, there have been lots of accounts that have been written of Plassey. What happened? Plassey is the name of the battlefield. It's sort of between Calcutta and Murshidabad, so, you know, about 150, 200 kilometers from Calcutta, right? And that's where this battle, so-called battle, is going to take place. I don't know if we should dignify this encounter with a word, because if you read the actual accounts of what happened, one of the things that had happened was that an agreement had been made by Robert Clive with Mir Jafar, who's related. All these three people that you're reading about, Siraj-ud-daulah, Mir Jafar, Mir Kasam, they're all related to each other. Mir Jafar is the commander of the Nawab's armies. He has made an agreement with him that I will install you as the Nawab if you betray Siraj-ud-daulah, right? And if you read the accounts, the battle, which lasted a few hours, right, was its future was uncertain, because it seemed that Mir Jafar would not initially betray Siraj-ud-daulah, but then in the course of the battle he does so. He does so. Siraj-ud-daulah is going to suffer a crushing defeat. Just to give you, by the way, a sense of what these armies are, the Nawab's army has 50,000 sepoys, right? So sepoys are foot soldiers. Clive's army has 2,000 sepoys and 800 British soldiers. Okay, a large part of the Nawab's army is going to defect, okay, to Clive. Siraj-ud-daulah himself is going to flee the scene. He's going to be found in a gutter several days dead, right? And Mir Jafar is going to become the Nawab. Now, in return for this, Clive is going to get 200,000 pounds. He's going to become a mansabdar of the Mughal emperor, because officially, remember, the Nawab of Bengal is still a vassal of the Mughal emperor, officially, okay? And he's going to get a private jagir. A jagir is a landed estate, right, with the rights to collect the revenues to that particular estate. Okay. Now, the story of what transpires in the next few years is too sordid, frankly. I mean, even the most conservative British historians would agree to that, right? Partly because what's going to happen is that the British under Clive, they're going to milk Mir Jafar as much as they can. When they find that, look, they've basically milked this guy, they're going to turn over the Nawabship to Mir Kasam, who's related to Mir Jafar. Okay? And this is going to be a few years after 1757. And then a few years after that, once they've milked Mir Kasam, okay, and Mir Kasam is now getting a little fed up, and he's getting a little fed up for two reasons, because the company is constantly exacting pressure on him to give more revenues. There's also private employees of the East India Company who are pilfering money off. Remember the old problem I mentioned to you, that not all the trade that is happening under the auspices of the East India Company. That the servants of the East India Company, which is what they're called, employees of the East India Company, they're not simply doing all of this to fill the coffers of the company. They are filling their own pockets as well by the side. So Mir Kasam in 1763, 1764 is going to forge an alliance when he's really fed up with the company, and he's going to try to get the company off his back. He is going to forge an alliance with the Nawab of Awadh, okay, and the Mughal emperor, and the three of them together are going to fight the company at a place called Buxar, and they're going to lose that battle. Okay, it's called the Battle of Buxar. So first there's a Battle of Plassey, 1757, and then you have the Battle of Buxar, which is about 1763, 1764. All right? This is sort of the brief military account. And then when Mir Kasam is defeated, guess who's restored back to the throne? Mir Jafar. Okay? And this is what I mean. It's a really sordid account. And some people have argued, in fact, Nehru wrote in The Discovery of India, that British rule in India really began with a long history of deceit, bribery, and corruption. Right? This is, in effect, the beginnings of British rule in India. Right? Now there are going to be a number of different consequences. But let me just finish up with Clive for a second, just so you get some sense into his character. And, you know, the dramatic nature of some of this history. Clive, when he goes back to England, is going to be put on trial on charges of misdemeanors and crimes committed in India, including such things as corruption and bribery. He's going to be put on trial. Now, Clive had amassed a huge fortune, And it wasn't simply Clive, it was the officers of the company who plundered Bengal. There was a film, by the way, that was made in 1933 in the United States. It's called Clive of India. If you can somehow get hold of it, you'd be really interested to see it. And there's a scene there. Now, no doubt this is obviously Hollywood, so there's a bit of a flair. There's going to be some rhetorical exaggeration of a kind. But there's an interesting scene in there where after the Battle of Plassey, okay, Clive is taken to the treasury, right? Mir Jafar takes him into the treasury, and he opens the door, and the floor is littered with rubies and diamonds. And he says to Clive, take whatever you want. Right? Take whatever you want. This is the loot and plunder of Bengal that they talk about. I mean, there used to be a strand of historiography which used to argue. I think that that argument is considered to be a bit extravagant now. But that argument was that the Industrial Revolution, to some extent, was fueled by the plunder. The Industrial Revolution in England was fueled by the plunder of Bengal. But nonetheless, what's interesting is that Clive, when he is put on trial, so all these charges are read out, the trial takes place over a period of several months, and Clive says, and I'm quoting his exact words, with an absolute look of astonishment on his face when these charges are read out, he says, "Here I stand, my lords, astonished at my own moderation. I could have taken everything in India, but yeah, I just took a few million pounds. Why are you putting me on trial? Why are you putting me to this great trial in strength?" Right? That's essentially the argument that Clive is going to give, and you can read this in the transcript of the trial that we have. Okay? Now, there is also going to be enormous chaos following the Battle of Plassey and the Battle of Buxar, because what's quite clear is that if, in effect, the British have become the Nawab, and this is going to be consolidated when the Mughal emperor is going to officially appoint the East India Company as the Diwan of Bengal, meaning they have the rights to collect the revenue of Bengal. Okay? Not just a few small districts here and there. They have the rights to collect the revenue. They become the principal revenue collector, which means of the Mughal emperor, because the Mughal emperor is still the titular head. He is still the official head. Okay? And he is sitting much further west. Now, in fact, they had moved to Allahabad for a short time, then they're going to move back to Delhi. Another story in itself. But the important thing here, as I said, is that the Nawab, the company, in fact, becomes the Nawab of Bengal, effectively speaking, and acquires the right to collect the revenues of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, what would become the Bengal presidency for the most part. All right? This is that story. And because of this chaos, unrest, disorder, there's going to be gross mismanagement in Bengal. And I think it is no exaggeration to say that the history of the British in India is book-ended by famines. In 1770, you're going to have a famine in Bengal, which is going to cause the loss of roughly 1/3 of the population of the province. 10 million people are going to die. And when I say it's book-ended, remember that the British independence is 1947, so you have the Great Bengal Famine of 1943 in the midst of World War II. Right? And if you read the accounts of famines, I mean, the person who is the most authoritative scholar on this question in the world is Amartya Sen. And if you read his work on famines, it's very clear that famines are almost always caused they're not a feature of some natural disaster. Okay? They are caused by what happens in markets. And what he has a theory which he calls the theory of entitlements, that when people become incapable actually of buying food. Okay? And then, of course, you might have a spike in prices. Right? And what was happening in 1943, and this is important for us so that you understand these bookends that I'm talking about, is that the British had decided that they were going to send food to their troops fighting the war in the Pacific, in places like Australia. Okay? This is one of the things that's going to cause the famine in Bengal. Right? And so I think that it's a sorry commentary on what were the consequences, the tragic consequences of British rule for India, if you look at the 1750s, leading to the famine of 1770, and then what happens towards the very end in the 1940s. All right? However, we need to move beyond the 1750s and 60s now. So now the rights to the Diwani have been acquired by the East India Company. The East India Company is in effect now ruling parts of eastern India. Okay? And in fact, Clive will have himself elected governor of Bengal. He's not the Governor General of India at this point in time. He's the Governor of Bengal for a very short period of time. Remember the presidency system. So each of these presidencies is going to have a governor. And then you're going to have a man called the Governor General. The first Governor General of India is Warren Hastings, whose name I've written on board there. The traditional histories would describe him as the architect of the British Empire in India. If Clive was a man who laid the foundations by winning the battle at Plassey, Warren Hastings, who's going to rule for 14 years, right? And who's going to become the Governor General. Who was Warren Hastings? He is also an employee of the East India Company. But his rise is not as meteoric as Clive's. It's not as rapid. Okay? It's more slow and steady. He's been working for the company for a period of time. Slowly he rises through the ranks, shows that he has an enormous number of administrative skills. He also has some gift with languages. He's interested in Indian languages. He's a patron of Indian texts. The Bhagavad Gita will be translated into English for the first time under his administration. And if you read his foreword to the Gita, it's quite an extraordinary foreword, because he's very clear about the fact that the teachings of the Gita are really quite different than what are available to those who have grown up under the Christian dispensation. But nonetheless, he says that the Gita is a work of immense philosophical beauty and significance, right? And so he's going to have this work translated into English, right? Right, so he's a patron of knowledge, very different from Clive in this respect. He's going to stay on in India for a substantial number of years. There's going to be a much bigger trial against him in Britain, again a chapter unto itself. When he returns to England, he's going to be put on charges, on trial on charges of crime, corruption, and so on. This trial is going to last for over a decade. In fact, it's one of the masterpieces of 18th century English political history, because his opponent is going to be Edmund Burke. A few of you might know him as the author of a famous book on the revolutions in France, right? Okay, right. So Edmund Burke is going to be the person who's going to bring the charges against him. And as I said, that's an interesting history unto itself. It's important because what it underscores again is the fact that the Britishers who had lived in India in the late 18th century and who then went back were very often seen as a threat to the established aristocratic order back in England itself. Okay, that these are people who are coming from India with immense fortunes. They are going to try to disrupt the nature of politics in Britain. They're going to try to buy their way into politics. They're going to use their influence and their money. And these people do not come from traditional aristocratic families, right? So they're the upstarts, the nouveau riche. And so there's the contempt for the nouveau riche that you usually find for them everywhere in the world, right? And this is the importance, and of course this is one of the reasons why Warren Hastings is in fact actually going to be tried. Now Warren Hastings is going to put into place a number of different measures, okay? But one thing that we have to think about, and this is where I want you to turn your attention to the board here, is the relationship between the company and their offices in London. Because you have to just sit back for a second and think about what's happening here. A group of men who had come to India to trade suddenly find themselves in possession. Okay? The sudden here is not all that sudden, because it's been happening over a period of 125, 150 years, but then suddenly, after Plassey, they acquire the right to the Diwani. Okay? These English men find themselves now becoming governors and rulers. They're not simply traders. And the question is going to be, how is one going to regulate the affairs of the East India Company? And to understand that, you need to know two things, one of which is mentioned on the board here, the other I'll mention in my remarks. And the structure very simply is the following, that the company the headquarters of the company, the EIC is East India Company, the headquarters of the company are in London. The company has what is called a court of directors, which is the larger governing body, the court of directors is comprised of nearly 2,000 people. And it's comprised of people who own a certain minimum amount of stock in the company. They have a voting right. But of course, the day-to-day management cannot be left to a board or a group of people 2,000 in number. That's much too large. So what you have is a smaller group of people known as the Board of Control. Okay? The Board of Control, comprised of a much smaller group of people who basically make decisions regarding the day-to-day management of the company. And one of the offices under this Board of Control is the office of the Examiner of Correspondence. Right? This is the office in which James Mill, the author of the History of British India, who I mentioned to you before at some length in one of my previous lectures, he's going to be working in this office. He's eventually going to rise to become the Examiner of Correspondence, which is the chief person there. And his son, the famous English philosopher John Stuart Mill, will be also employed in this office. In fact, that is going to be effectively the only paid employment that John Stuart Mill is ever going to have, except for a very short period of time that he served as a member of Parliament in Britain, okay, much later on. Right? So this is the office of the Examiner of Correspondence. And what does this office do? Literally, it examines the correspondence and it drafts the correspondence. What correspondence are we talking about? What if Warren Hastings wants to create some kind of policy, right? And he thinks that he has to seek the approval of the company. Now there's an interesting tension here, because in principle, the company's officers in India are subject to the rules laid down by the head office in London. There's only one problem. How are you going to implement these rules? This is the age, long before the telephone, the telegraph, all of that. So what if the board of directors, the Board of Control in London says, well, we must pursue such and such policy? It takes 6 months at a minimum for a letter to get to India. Right? So the officer sends a letter to London. Then they're going to look over the letter, they're going to draft a reply, then they're going to send a reply back. And what if Warren Hastings or his successor wanted to reply back? This exchange of correspondence could take several years. Now, if you've got a crisis going on, that's not going to do any good. And so, in effect, what I'm saying to you is, what emerges is the theory of what I call the man on the spot. He effectively decides. You've got this regulative structure over there, okay, back in London, but for moments of crisis, moments where you have to make an instantaneous political decision, it is really going to be the man on the spot, the person who's there, who's going to make that decision. Okay? But what this structure intends to do is to effectively control the company's long-term policies, because now, by the 1770s, 1780s, people are already thinking about the long term. Okay? Is the company here going to be staying in India for a period of time? Are there territories going to expand? Right? People are thinking of the long term here, which is why it's important to know what the structure here is that we're speaking about. Okay, this is one set of considerations that is exceedingly important if you're thinking about the company and its relations to people back in England itself. Okay? And here again, you have to keep in mind something that I've mentioned on a number of occasions, which is that the company's offices in London are effectively not able to do much to control private corruption and bribery that is happening along the side. Okay? Now, one other framework that you might want to think about is, as the company's territories continue to expand, what are the different theories of governance deployed by the British in India? Okay, and when I say company's territories are going to expand, here, if you turn your moment to this section of the board for a second, this is a long and complicated political military history which I'm going to encompass in about 2 minutes, right? from the 1770s all the way until the 1850s. So in the south you have a man called Tipu Sultan. He's a Muslim ruler. Okay, he's the son of Hyder Ali. Hyder Ali is going to become a major force down in the south in Mysore. He's going to be succeeded by his son. There's a TV serial that has been made, by the way, about Tipu Sultan, quite a controversial figure, because again this is where communalism comes in. There's a whole strand of Indian historians who've tried to argue that that Hyder and Tipu were ferocious Muslim rulers. Well, we know, by the way, that Tipu Sultan had a Hindu advisor, a Brahmin as his main advisor. We know that they're Hindus who served in the army. Right? This is where, again, we have to be a little careful, trying to assume that these people are acting simply as Muslim rulers or Hindu rulers, whatever the case might be. But they are going to pose a threat to the British in Mysore for a substantial period of time before they finally get annihilated. Hyder Ali, I think, is going to die sometime around 1790, 91. Tipu Sultan about 1799 or thereabouts, roughly. Right? In the Punjab, so if you now move to northwest India, there's going to be a kingdom there that's going to develop there under Ranjit Singh. It's called the Sikh kingdom, a very powerful kingdom. At the death of Ranjit Singh in 1839, the British are going to make a move. And what they're going to do is they're going to eventually enter into what are called the Anglo-Sikh wars. There are going to be a number of Anglo-Sikh wars. By the 1840s, the Punjab has been incorporated into British India. Okay, so Mysore, Tipu Sultan, they've been neutralized just before 1800. The Punjab absorbed into India, into British India by 1840. On the southeast frontiers, you have what are called the Anglo-Burmese wars. Okay? I mean, the company is in fact not simply a trading company. It's engaging in wars of expansion. That's why just the sheer list of these activities gives you some idea of what's really going on. The Anglo-Burmese wars fought from the 1820s onwards. One way to think about what's happening here is they are expanding the frontier. They're expanding the frontier. The frontier is always going to be a critical issue for the British. You know, you want to continue to create a buffer zone between yourselves and the others. One of the people there, one of the countries that they're really worried about is Russia. Right? And for those of you who've heard the phrase, the great game, which is still going on, frankly, in that part of the world, okay? I mean, if you've been following what's been happening in Afghanistan and, you know, the contest that goes on, it's part of the great game. This is a phrase first used by Kipling, right? The English novelist in his work, because large part of his work was focused on this northwest frontier. It's an attempt to create a distance between yourself and other great powers. You expand the frontier. You create a buffer zone. And I would suggest go back to the Guptas and think about what they were doing. Okay? Right? To some extent, it has resonance with that. This is what the British are doing in the 19th century. Right? So Southeast India, Northwest India, South India, in Western India, the Marathas are still going to be a powerful player, but finally they are going to get annihilated at a big battle in 1818. That's going to bring an end to the Maratha Confederacy forever, right? And the Ranjit Singh Sikh kingdoms I've already spoken about there in relationship to the Anglo-Sikh wars. There's a conquest of Sindh, which is much further west, attempted by Lord Napier with success in 1843, right? So you can see that military expansion of territories is an integral part of the company's policies. Now, there is, of course, dispute about that in the company's headquarters in London. The company is always worried about the company becoming much bigger than its boots, right? Where are they going to get the money? Where are they going to get the revenue to launch all of these incredibly expensive wars, right? Where is the revenue going to come from? These are the questions that are going to come up all the time. And one of the ways in which they're going to resolve it, to just give you an instance, right, of the structural changes that are going to take place under the British, one of the ways they're going to resolve it is through something like what is called the Permanent Settlement of 1793. What is the Permanent Settlement? Okay, this is a settlement that takes place in Bengal under Cornwallis. Right? I don't know if the name rings a bell for somebody here in this room. It should. Right? because it shows you again the links between India and other parts of the empire. Cornwallis, the man who suffered a disastrous defeat and was disgraced, right, in America, because essentially he's viewed as one of the people responsible for the fall of the British in America, right? Well, he's sent off to India. I guess it was a punishment posting, right, or maybe a reward, who knows, right, for Cornwallis, right? So Cornwallis is going to become the Governor General of India. And it is during his time that the permanent settlement will be instituted. What the permanent settlement is, very briefly, is it's an arrangement by which the British come up with an assured source of revenue, and it has to do with their understanding of property rights and land distribution in the presidency of Bengal. Okay? If you are going to collect the revenue, remember that the British, i.e. the East India Company, has acquired the right to collect the revenue. Now the question is, how do they collect the revenue? How do they know what the revenue is? There are, of course, revenue records, right? But they want to, in a sense, start afresh. They want to see if this revenue assessment that you had before was appropriate or not. Was it scientific enough or not? Okay? So what they are going to do is, they are going to enter into an agreement with the big landholders. They are called zamindars. The big landholders in Bengal. And they're going to say, in 1793, we are going to fix the revenue assessment at such and such level. The year that this level is fixed is 1789-90. Okay? So the assessment that was done in 1789-90 becomes the yardstick by which the British are now going to collect this revenue when they make this agreement in 1793. What this means, very simply, is the following. That let's take a random figure, let's supposing they set the revenue assessment at £1,000, the equivalent of £1,000 per annum with a particular landlord. What if the crop the following year is very good? Well, the British may lose a bit, right? Because the zamindar, if the crop is very good, he might actually have a very good revenue assessment, but he is only obligated to pay the British £1,000. On the other hand, what if the crop was very poor? Right? You have to look at the other side of it. Well, he's still obligated to pay the British £1,000. That's why it's called the permanent settlement. And of course, to make sure that they cut their losses, the risk of their losses, the revenue assessment was initially set reasonably high. And what this also meant was that zamindars who could not pay the assessment over a period of some years, they forfeited the right to their property because the British would put it on auction. Okay? So what it did was it created enormous class inequalities in that part of India. It created a new class of zamindars modeled after the British aristocratic elite. You see, the British are trying to create a new class of people because they believe that in principle the right to individual property is not respected in India. And for them this has consequence, because their view is that if the right to individual property is not respected, there will be no incentive for the farmer or the landholder to improve his land. If you do not believe that the land that you are tilling and improving is your land, if you think that it can be taken away, appropriated by somebody else, you have less incentive to develop the land. Right? And of course the argument is that in older times, the land was never secure. Why was it never secure? Oriental despotism. Remember the theory of Oriental despotism. Right? So what they're trying to do is, they're trying to create a class of people in Britain, in India, who will look very much like the aristocratic landed elite back in England itself. This is the zamindar. This is what is called the zamindari system. The permanent settlement of 1793 creates a zamindari system. It also pushes the smaller landlords into oblivion. They're going to be wiped out, many of them. Right? This is an illustration of the kinds of structural changes that come into India with the British in the late 1700s, moving into the 1800s. Okay, right? Now, let's try to fill up the picture with some other things that are happening in India at this point in time. Okay, and I'm not maintaining strict chronological rigor here because I'm moving between the late 1700s and the early 1800s all the way until 1857. One thing we have to think about is the ethos of improvement, which has two different aspects to it: moral improvement and material improvement. When I say material improvement, what I mean here are such things as, for example, the bringing of the telegraph to India, 1851, the bringing of railways to India, 1853. In April of 1853, the first railway line from Bombay to Thane, 21 miles, right, is going to be established. Uniform postage. In other words, a system of communications. Uniform postage is brought in 1853. They have an Indian Postal Act in 1837, and then they have, a uniform postage. So postage, telegraph, trains. This is what I'm calling material improvement. Then there is a whole question of moral improvement, okay? Because of course the British believe that to some extent they have a civilizing mission, right? That India has fallen into bad ways, that this was a once glorious civilization that has now decayed, right? And it is our moral responsibility to bring in the light of Christian civilization to these people. But there's a set of complications here. The problem is this, that if you try to bring in Christianity forcibly, you might in fact induce a spirit of unrest and dissent among your subjects. They're extremely worried about that. So in fact, under the terms of the charter of the East India Company, Christian missionary activity was not permitted in India in the second half of the 1700s. And it is only when the charter is renewed in 1813. In 1813, so the charter is renewed every so often, and it is during that round of review, when the charter is reviewed in 1813, that Christian missionaries are going to be permitted into the country. Okay? And it is not surprising that many of these changes that I am going to encompass under moral improvement, these are going to take place after Christian missionary activity is going to be permitted. In the 1820s, the Governor General of India is a man known as Bentinck. Okay? And Bentinck is very firm in his mind that what you need is a government which is inspired by Christian sentiments. All right? But just keep his name in mind for a second, keep the argument on improvement in mind for a moment, and let me turn your attention to this, which I was about to do 10-15 minutes ago, and I want to get back to it now. As I said, there are four theories of governance that the British deploy. Different administrators belong to different schools of thought, although I have to say at the outset that the dominant school of thought unquestionably is the utilitarian school. So the utilitarian school of thought basically says that, look, our function is to provide a government that is efficient. And James Mill, who is the father of utilitarianism, same man who wrote History of British India, okay? Right? Mill, by the way, never visits India. Let me reiterate that once again, okay? And he's going to become the great authority, the great lawmaker, right? So James Mill is very sure that that efficient government means good government, protection of property rights, low taxation. He could be a modern day Republican if you ask me. Okay? I mean, very much that same kind of platform. Low taxation or no taxation, right? That government which serves efficiently with least disruption of the norms of that society, tending towards utility, that is the best government that you can have. This is the utilitarian school of thought. Many of the English ruling classes in India are inspired by this ideology. Okay? Some also have an evangelical disposition. Bentinck, the Governor General of India in the late 1820s, is of that disposition. Evangelical meaning precisely what the word means, that one of the things we have to do, so there are this school of people in England who are called the evangelicals, And what they want to do is they want to ensure that when the British become rulers in places like India, that they do so not simply from a utilitarian standpoint, but in fact that they do so from a Christian standpoint. Okay? This doesn't mean, by the way, that the evangelicals are not utilitarian minded at all. They are. But they want to combine their utilitarianism with an evangelical flavor. So of course they are in support of Christian missionary activity in India. Right? Then you have a school of thought, so you can say that A and B constitute one pair, C and D, the Platonic and the Burkean constitute another pair. They're very much alike, the Platonic and the Burkean. What do these people believe? They basically believe the following. Indians are largely like children, and the rulers have to act as guardians. As guardians. Okay? You are trustees. Now there's a variation in that, which is a distinction between the Platonic and the Burkean view. There's a slight variation. Okay? The variation is the following. The British, in this school of thought, the British imagine themselves that they are trustees, they're guardians. Until such time as the Indians grow up. Think about children, right? I mean, you want to establish an account in the name of your child who's 2 years old. You're a trustee. That's how banks work even today. You're a trustee, right? Until such time as that person attains maturity, right? So you think of yourself as a trustee. Until such time as Indians learn to govern themselves, the British will continue to rule India. Now there's one school of thought which thinks the Indians are never going to learn. They are going to continue to remain children for the most part, because there is an inherent difference between the East and the West. There is another school of thought which thinks that, well, over a period of time, Indians are going to learn how to acquire the tools of governorship. They're going to display qualities of rationality, they're going to be mature, and they are going to take decisions which tend towards good governance. Okay? That's going to be the essential difference. There are lots of other differences that we can think about as well, but this is going to be one of the principal distinctions between the Platonists and the Burkeans. All right? So these are the theories of governance. Now Bentinck is a person who represents the evangelical school of thought, and if you go back to the strand of thought I was talking about here, namely improvement, how do you introduce moral improvement among these people? Well, one of the ways you do it is by legislation. And to give you an illustration of that legislation, in 1829 the British are going to pass a law prohibiting the practice of sati in their territories in British India. And what is sati? Sati is a practice of widow immolation, right? Where a woman would burn herself at the funeral pyre of her husband. Okay, this doesn't mean, of course, by the way, that this was practiced by all women across all communities in all of India. It's happening in very, very small communities, happening particularly in Rajasthan and happening in Bengal. Okay, and there's been a school of thought which has argued that in fact actually sati was a response to the disorder, the unrest created by British rule in India, particularly when times became really bad, right? When people become dispensable, then there are going to be certain people who are going to become dispensable before others become dispensable. We don't have the time to look at the very complicated set of reactions that came in when the British proposed that they were going to abolish sati. There is an Indian social reformer by the name of Ram Mohan Roy, who himself is a proponent of this legislation. So one of the reasons why the British could go ahead with this legislation is because there were a school of reformers in India who are beginning to emerge in the 1810s and 1820s, who take essentially the British view here that the purpose of a modern enlightened government is to do away with practices of this kind. Okay? And so this is going to be an illustration. It's not the only thing. There are going to be a huge range of laws that are going to be passed by the British in India in the first half of the 19th century, but this is an illustration of what I call improvement. Okay? And then if you look at education, I spoke to you about the minute written by Lord Macaulay, 2nd February 1835, which is called the Minute on Indian Education, right? And what this Minute on Indian Education does is it stipulates that henceforth all the funds of the government of British India are going to be spent on education, which is going to be in English and is going to be utilitarian in tone, right? It's not necessary for students to learn Sanskrit poetry, Arabic poetry, Persian poetry, Sanskrit metaphysics. In fact, all of that obscures the fundamental questions of life as far as somebody like Macaulay is concerned. Right? I had a brief discussion of that when I talked about what I call the Anglicist Orientalist controversy, okay, a couple of weeks ago. Right? So this is the situation that you need to think about. Now, let me take a few minutes to describe to you the economic situation in India, because this is then what is going to lead us to 1857. I'm not going to be able to get to that today, the rebellion of 1857, 1858, but I've pretty much laid the groundwork for that. The economic situation that I want to describe to you is the following. My own view of the matter is that the British did very little, if anything, to develop Indian industry. There used to be a debate that used to take place in the 50s, 60s, 70s for a very long period of time. It was called the de-industrialization debate. Did British rule actually de-industrialize India? Okay? And yeah, there are various kinds of research, scholarly materials that one can use to try to intervene in this particular debate. But let me just lay out for you the scenario in very broad terms so that you can keep that in mind when you think about what's happening in the economy in British India. In 1700, India, China, and Europe each accounted for about 23% of the world's GDP. India, China, and Europe. Roughly 23% of the world's GDP is accounted for by each of these three actors. That's a total of 70%. The rest of the world accounted for 30% of the world's GDP. Okay, these figures are from a book called The Origins of the Modern World, if somebody wants to look it up, by Robert Marx. But again, there's a large literature on this question. I'm just giving you one source. In 1750, China's share was 33%. And India's and Europe's share was still about 23%. But this meant that together, the three accounted for 80% of the world's GDP. Even in 1800, which is some decades after British rule had been established in India, but remember that at this point in time, they're more prominent in eastern India, in Bengal. I mean, the Punjab is not under them, Western India is not under them, right? But you can see the decline of India's share of the world's GDP. India accounted for 18%, Europe for 26%, and China for 30%. By 1890, Europe's share had risen to 40%. The US accounted for 15% by 1890 of the world's GDP. And India and China had 11 and 14% respectively. By 1947, at the time of independence, India accounted for less than 1% of the world's GDP. Okay? This is the during, so you can see the long years of colonial rule. You go from accounting for 23% of the world's GDP to about 1% of the world's GDP. Okay? And if you read Karl Marx, Capital, Volume 1, there is a very long account in there of what happened to the textile industry in India. And what happened to the textile industry can be encapsulated, my last remark, in the following way, that India, which used to be the largest exporter of cotton textiles in the world, became, by the second half of the 19th century, the largest importer of cotton textiles in the world. And it's worthwhile reading Capital Volume 1 to see how that happened. All right? Okay, so I'm going to have to end over here, and we will continue this narrative on Monday.